Hello, everybody. Lovely to be joining everybody. Good evening, Ruth. Lovely to have you along.
Thank you so much and lovely to be here.
Thank you, thank you. We're going to give it another 2 minutes and then we will start. Two more minutes, please. Thank you so much. Okay, everybody, we're almost at 5 past and it's time to get going. I'm looking forward to tonight's chat and I know that our parents are going to find the information from the esteemed, the most wonderful, the most knowledgeable Ruth. Very, very informative. We know a little bit about Ruth. We've worked with Ruth before and we've heard about what Ruth has to say around tax issues not too long ago during the COVID period. You helped us so much and that has been really, really useful. And at the time, the parents that attended used that information and really sought a lot of tax relief. And we went through a wobbly period as well on the tax front, where parents were trying to make, trying to apply for their rebates, and SARS was being obstinate, saying, people with special needs and families with special needs shouldn't be entitled to the tax relief that they deserve. And then a few of us wrote into SARS and said, come on, guys, this is ridiculous. You need to reconsider. And it was so wonderful when SARS realized, I'm not sure if it was the individual letters, but it certainly was the bulk, the collective sway of idea that people were just not happy. Families said they deserved more than what was on offer. And eventually SARS said, we need to reconsider, and they rolled back to the previous rebate entitlements which families are entitled to. But we're not going to talk about tax tonight. I just thought, because the wonderful Ruth is here, we know that being treated fairly and families having accessible access to the support that they need, especially all the neurodiverse families, this is close to her heart and it is close to our heart. So we're going to hand over to you in just a few moments, and Mrs. McKelvey is going to do the welcome. But from my side, Mrs. McKelvey, do I need to do a few housekeeping things?
Mr. Barry, I thought that you were busy with the welcome. That sounded like a welcome to me.
It's welcome to Mrs. McKelvey.
So Ruth, yes, we just want to say thank you very much for actually joining us here. And we're all quite excited to hear what you have to say. And the topic that you're actually speaking on tonight is very close to my heart. And it was actually something that I had asked Jen to investigate a little bit further for us. We did do an article about it in our monthly newsletter. But we're very excited to hear you talk about it in detail, and hopefully to give the parents an opportunity to ask some questions. Because very often they are a little bit confused about the teenagers and the teenage behavior. So hopefully you can enlighten us all a little bit more. And then housekeeping, Mr. Barry, we're going to tend to at the end of the meeting.
Is that the way you want to play it tonight? You see, Ruth, Mrs. McKelvey and the team, we all keep each other on our toes. And as we go along, yeah, we figure out how it's going to be. But thank you. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much. Sorry, Jackie, is it over to you or over to me?
Ruth, it's over to you, please.
Thank you. But I just wanted to say thank you, Jackie, for the warm welcome. And Justin, you said very generous things about me, so thank you. And I am delighted that SARS has become a little bit more reasonable in terms of just giving parents what they deserve. So it's nothing additional. It's what really they need and deserve. So thank you. Yes, so this is a very important topic in terms of trying to understand what normal teenage behavior is, and when it's something to worry about. And although I've been dealing with teenagers in my practice for 30 years, I've only just had my own teenagers for the last 3-4 years. So everything I said in terms of telling parents and working with teenagers, I'm now living in 24 hours. So there's a lot of compassion and increased empathy for all teenagers themselves and all parents of teenagers, because it's really not easy being a teenager. There's angst, there's emotions, there are hormones, and there've been preconceived notions for generations in terms of why teenagers act so recklessly and emotionally. And many of these explanations have turned out to be incorrect. It was once believed that teens were impulsive mainly due to raging hormones and because they hated authority. But because of advances in brain imaging, we now know that it's much more complicated. It turns out that our brains take much longer to develop than we thought. In adults, various parts of our brains work together, well, they're supposed to work together, to evaluate choices, make decisions, and act accordingly in each situation. That doesn't happen with adolescents. There is massive reorganization of the brain between 12 and 25 years old. The brain doesn't actually grow very much during this period. It's already at its full size by the time a person is 6. And the thickening skull accounts for most head growth, afterwards. Hold on 1 second. There's just an issue with my voice here. There we go. Sorry, I'm back again. So what happens is, by the time we are 6 years old, our brains have grown to almost 90% of the full size that it's going to grow. The rest of the growth is actually, the rest of the head growth is actually the skull thickening. So it's actually, the brain has reached its maximum size for girls it's 11.5 and for boys it's 14.5. But just remember, maximum brain size does not mean maximum brain maturity. The brain continues to mature for at least another 10 years. So the brain doesn't grow by getting substantially larger, but during the teenage years, but rather through increased connectivity between the different brain regions. And this helps us to understand why teenagers act and react the way that they do. So during adolescence, the brain undergoes extensive remodeling, resembling like a network and wiring upgrade. And we know sometimes how network and wiring upgrades can go. They don't always go so smoothly. So essentially, two things that are happening in the brain during adolescence. On the one hand, there's what we call proliferation. So there's rapid growth of brain matter and the formation of new connections in the brain. So the synapses that are being used grow stronger. But in addition, there's also a pruning process. So the brain starts pruning away the synapses that it doesn't need in order to make the remaining ones strong. Think of it like pruning a rose bush. So you prune away the weaker branches, so the remaining important branches are stronger and can grow stronger. Pruning is actually a use it or lose it principle. So if you don't use something, you're going to lose it. So for example, dancing or music or languages, if you don't use it during the adolescent years, those synapses are going to be part of what gets pruned. So it really is, if there's something that your teen has been interested in, this is the time to really make sure that they keep doing it, because otherwise it won't be there anymore. So now legally, you might be considered an adult when you turn 18 or 21, but from the neuroscience perspective, your brain is really still developing. As I said, the current literature suggests that it's only at around 25 that the brain finishes its period of development. Now, it's very important to realize that the brain develops from the back to the front. So the last place to have these fast-acting connections is our frontal lobes. Adults think with their prefrontal cortex, which is at the front of the frontal lobe. This is the brain's rational part. So this is the part of the brain that you need to make good decisions, to evaluate, to think about consequences, to think about the future, to plan. So it's got to do with impulse control, planning, judgment, and empathy. But it's not that teens don't have frontal lobe capabilities, but rather that their signals are not getting to the back of their brain fast enough to regulate their emotions. So you might have noticed that sometimes your child's thinking and behavior seems so mature, but at other times they might seem to behave in ways that are completely irrational, completely impulsive, emotional, and just very hard to understand. And the reason we can understand these shifts and changes is it's the back to front development of the brain, because our teenagers are working with brains that are still under construction. Adolescents and even children can demonstrate impulse control skills. With age and brain maturation becomes the ability to consistently use those skills. And that's the key, is that our teenagers don't use these skills consistently. They're really like Ferraris with weak brakes. So they're learning machines, but they can learn good and they can learn bad things. Now, I think one of the things that we know about teenagers is their extreme emotional reactions. So we're often perplexed when our teenagers react like it's an international incident, when it's actually something quite innocuous and really unimportant to us. So although the development of the prefrontal cortex is the last on the developmental checklist, there is another part of the brain that is fully active in adolescence, and that's the limbic system. That is the area of the brain that controls emotions. So it's the seat of risk, reward, impulsivity, and instant gratification. So, and the limbic system develops at the onset of puberty, so between the ages of 10 and 12. So that for them, they are uniquely experiencing what for them is an international incident. It's almost like we need to remind ourselves that they are experiencing emotions in technicolor, and we are experiencing emotions in black and white. So it makes you understand a little bit more why they behave the way they do. They are built to be novelty seeking at this point, but their frontal lobe isn't able to say, that's a bad idea, don't do it. It's not happening to the extent it should happen. And in stable adults, there are many adults who still don't have a frontal lobe that works as effectively as it should. But with adolescents, their frontal lobe really doesn't do the job that it needs to do. So it's now believed that the mismatch in the development of the impulse control part of the brain and then the hormone emotional fuel part of the brain is what causes the risk-taking behavior that we worry about so much in our teenagers. Because the prefrontal cortex communicates with the brain's emotional center through intricate connections. In these adults, as I mentioned, the connections have been strengthened through experience and maturation, but during adolescence, the connections are not fully developed. So it's much more difficult for teenagers to shut off their very intense emotional responses. And a question parents and teenagers often ask is, how can our teens be so clever, accomplished, and responsible, and so reckless or impulsive at the same time? And the answer is it's easily, because it seemed like a good idea at the time, which is the classic teenage excuse for poor choices, maybe more a product of an unfinished brain wiring rather than any deliberate recklessness. Another thing that is important to talk about and understand is what happens to our teenagers and their brains in terms of sleep requirements. When teen hormones reach a specific level, teenagers' fall asleep time usually drops back by about 2 hours. So when they've been in primary school, they might have fallen asleep at 9 or 10. Their brains won't let them fall asleep till 11 or midnight. And the National Sleep Association in the US has actually recommended and found that teenagers need at least 9 hours of sleep to perform optimally during the day. Now, our schools tend to start at about 7:30. So our adolescents are in a continuous state of jet lag, actually. And because a lot of the new wiring of the emotional centers and frontal lobes takes place during sleep, that means it's even more important that our teens get their sleep, because that's when the brain development happens. And this is bringing us to how to understand the fact that these dramatic changes in brain development during the teenagers' years, it's full of opportunity, but it's also full of vulnerability. So it's a time of phenomenal leaps in creativity and cognitive capacity. But it also, and the seeming paradox of adolescence is not a coincidence. The leaps in ability and the vulnerabilities are related to the adolescent's brain's remarkable ability to change. But it also means that risks for health issues, such as addiction, are also higher during this time, because addiction is simply a form of learning. It's the repeated stimulation of the reward circuit of the brain, which is more mature than the frontal lobe at that point. So the biology of teenage brains makes them much more susceptible to the effect of, just say, substances and stress. Teens can learn things harder, stronger, faster, and it means they can get addicted to things harder, stronger, faster. About 70% of mental illness, which includes anxiety, mood disorders, eating disorders, and psychosis, appears in the teen years and early adulthood. As parents, it's really hard to believe sometimes that our children might be struggling with mental health. But teenagers are commonly and increasingly facing issues like depression, anxiety, stress disorders. If you're trying to get into psychologists at the moment that deal with adolescents, it's really difficult because there's so much that our teens are struggling with. But now, with so many transitional and hormonal changes that take place during adolescence, it can be very difficult to work out, are the behaviors you're seeing red flags, or are they just typical teen behavior? And we need to keep our antennas up to determine, have we just got a moody child, or are we starting to see a mental illness? So instead of explaining what qualifies as healthy behavior, it's easier to detail which behaviors often indicate possible adolescent mental health issues. So I'm going to list some symptoms, but it's very important that you don't feel that because there's the isolated symptoms that your teen presents with, that this means they've got a mental health issue. It's the combination of these symptoms and the cluster. And then we have to look at, is this different to what other teens are going through, and how much are these symptoms impacting your child's ability to function? So obviously the overt symptoms like mood swings, irritability, anger, tearfulness, when there's excessive sadness, feelings of hopelessness, but when the excessive sadness seems to kind of just take hold and not let up, when you have notable changes in sleep, weight, eating habits, and other everyday patterns. In terms of sleep, we're talking about excessive sleepiness beyond the usual teenage fatigue. I think that 90% of the teenagers that I see in my practice start off every session by saying, I am so tired. And they're tired from school, they come back from their holidays tired, and they don't get enough sleep. But it's excessive tiredness, it's difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, frequent nightmares, and then also loss of interest in things that they used to enjoy and love. And it's not just because they're growing out of it, but suddenly not wanting to participate in hobbies that were important to them. Also, when they start cancelling with close friends with no good reasons or little explanation, withdrawing from family and community, but you have to be careful because it's a completely normal developmental stage to start finding your peers more interesting than your parents. But when there is a noticeable withdrawal, also low energy, lack of motivation, sometimes seeing a whole new set of friends that you've never met before, that can be a signal. We often see it presenting at school, either they're missing school refusal, or academic struggles that were not present before. So failing tests in subjects that they used to do well at, or not wanting to do homework in subjects that they used to enjoy. Excessive worry or fear that seems overwhelming. Not we all, but many of us suffer from anxiety. We live in very scary times, but it's when the fear is pervasive and it really takes hold, and the fear is excessive. And also they could cause, sometimes the fear causes physical discomfort, problems with breathing or stomach aches. So that kind of anxiety. Also extreme mood changes. And that's very hard to tell because our teens have mood changes, but when they bounce between moods of hyperactivity and then no energy. So it's uncontrollable highs and very low moods. Also multiple physical ailments without obvious causes. So headaches or stomach aches. When we see out of control, like severe risk-taking behaviors, confused thinking, delusions or hallucinations. Any talk of suicide is concerning and needs to be addressed. Refusing to talk about what's bothering them, even when you've made it as safe as possible. And another sign is sometimes they become obsessed with a certain goal, with a belief that if they don't achieve it, their lives will never be the same. Sometimes frequent temper tantrums and aggression. So it's very important that you don't, as I said before, just because you have there's one or two symptoms, it doesn't mean that there's a full-blown crisis. But it's when you consistently see some of these symptoms, it's time to open a conversation about mental health with your team. Do you want to stop for questions, or should I just carry on in terms of what do you suggest? Because there might have been questions that arise, but I'm happy to just keep talking.
All right, from my side, I can only see questions on Teams, and there's actually only my question, Jackie.
Okay.
Am I interrupting you, or you interrupting me, Jackie? I'll keep quiet and you go.
At the same time, like we usually do. Okay, Ruth, my question I think is quite important. As you know, that we are a school with children that have neurodiversities.
Yes.
Now, as a parent with a child that has a neurodiversity, would my child possibly be at more risk of mental health challenges? We definitely see lots of our students with anxieties, severe anxieties that add to whatever their difficulty is. But is there a concern to be concerned about anything more than that? Or, would it be see a psychiatrist sooner rather than later type scenario? I don't know the answers to these kind of questions.
I think with neurodiverse children, they're often at more risk because of the struggles they have interpersonally and the struggles they have in terms of understanding the world around them. So, as you say, excessive anxiety. So often we see kids who are neurodiverse have a lot more anxiety. They might have difficulties in terms of worrying about social interactions. There might be a lot more sensory issues. So there's a lot more kind of the sensory sensitivities. That means that they're more susceptible to feeling things really, really deeply that for other kids is not a challenge. So I would say it does increase the vulnerability. A lot of the kids probably who are neurodiverse and who have anxiety are probably already connected to therapists and to psychiatrists. So already that there's at least an understanding of what resources, especially in your school, of what resources there are. But yes, generally it does heighten vulnerability because already their brains are wired differently. But when you have the kind of resources and the kind of therapeutic input that these kids are receiving within your system, that already bolsters their resilience. And you've already got parents who are aware that there are differences and challenges that need to be addressed. So while there is an enhanced vulnerability within your system, I think you are at least dealing with parents who are aware of needing to look out for these things.
Ruth, what I also find sometimes with parents is that they've been fighting a struggle, most of them from when their children were very, very little. And I think that sometimes parents get to the point where they actually are now starting to get tired of the continuous therapy interventions, those kind of things. That does pose a little bit of a risk. So how do we as parents still manage to stay attentive enough and still manage to cope with the caregiver type fatigue that you would have with a neurodiverse child?
That's such an important question. And I think just to acknowledge that I've been talking about just general dealing with children and teenagers, saying how difficult it is. When you start adding the layers of dealing with neurodiverse kids, you're already, it just makes the layers so much more difficult. And I think what's most important is making sure that you've got support systems. So for the parents to have the support systems they need, so that if they are just too exhausted to see what's going on, they've got other people they can talk to. So whether it's informal support systems of other parents, friends, extended family, or their own therapy or their own counselors. Those kind of support systems are really important. But I think maintaining a connection to your child and being able to tell when things are very different to how they were before is when there need to be alarm bells, because you might have had certain struggles all the time, but if your child is starting to exhibit new symptoms, which is different to what you've seen before, then you need to relook. And I think it is about being as connected as you can with what's going on and with your child while you're looking after yourself, because exhausted, depleted parents, if they can't look after themselves, you can't look after your children. So self-care is so important. And then using the networks and supports around you, because I think you're absolutely right. It can be exhausting because everything has been a struggle. Everything's an issue. But it is important that you don't let things slip, because you need to look after yourself, and you need to make sure that you are getting the kind of fuel you need in order to keep being responsive, because it's very hard to be responsive and turned on all the time, because it gets to a point where you've just had enough. Yeah.
Okay. I've got another question, and I'm not quite, Justin, I'll give you a chance after this one question. Okay. And I'm not quite sure how to say this question. But so you've got the risky behaviors of teenagers, and you've often got them trying drugs or alcohol or cigarettes or whatever it is. How many of these teenagers that are on all their medications start to also self-medicate with other drugs or alcohol? How big a risk is that?
So, Jackie, what I have found is it's the kids who are not being medicated appropriately. It's the kids who are dealing with symptoms that they find unbearable that are at much more risk. I found that children who are appropriately treated are less at risk, actually, because they don't feel as desperate. A lot of the kids that I see who are using substances to soothe are those whose struggles have been ignored. And I have parents who refuse to medicate their kids because, they must learn resilience and work it out themselves. And those are the kids who struggle the most, because they are not, their distress feels unmanageable. But of course, yeah. So that's what I found, is that being on appropriate medication doesn't increase the risk. For me, the risk is the untreated anxieties, the untreated ADDs, the untreated depressions.
I imagine that would also increase the suicide risk as well.
Very much, very much. I listened to just my last session I had today was a teenager who played me a recording of someone close to her interacting with the parent, not her parent, and the teenager they're screaming at each other, and the teenager was saying, "You're so selfish, you don't even see that your daughter is suicidal and harming herself." And the mother said, I am so pleased you're comfortable enough to share your truth. And that was all she said. And then the teenager said, "But you don't do anything with my truth." And she said, "Well, we all have our own battles." And my heart just broke, because when you're dealing with parents who can't hear their children cries, and this child was just saying it so clearly, and she was being invalidated. Those are the children I really worry about, the children who feel that there is no one who hears them. And that is often where we start, and I haven't really spoken about this, but the self-harming behaviors.
Yeah, those seem to be serious and also to some degree, I think, fashionable.
Yes.
Where is the line between them?
Okay, so with social media, there's so much. I think in my day, there was always self-mutilation, but we didn't really know about it, and it wasn't it wasn't all over the place. Now, what our teens are seeing is they're seeing other people who are doing it and talking about it, and can look like it's quite trendy. However, I think it does become a vehicle for people who are not able to express or articulate their distress. Sometimes it's because they have such intense feelings, they feel like they're letting it out if they hurt themselves. Other times it's because they're numb. So they need to hurt themselves so they make themselves feel physical pain that represents their kind of psychic pain. With really healthy, stable kids, they might try to to just see what it's like, but generally it won't become something that they do regularly. When you're seeing that kids are doing it regularly, even if they're doing it because they're copying other kids, that's already a concern, that they're so susceptible to peer pressure. And I would say I would never ignore self-harming behavior. I'd rather, if you see self-harming behavior, you need to deal with it. I would get the child to a therapist to investigate what's going on. Self-harming behavior is different to suicidal attempts. The children who self-harm are not trying to kill themselves. They are trying to hurt themselves. Sometimes it's to shock their parents, but sometimes it's not because they cover it up. But it is a sign that something's wrong. And generally, you'll get a cluster of behaviors. You're not just going to get self-harming behaviors without anything else. So the clusters normally, self-mutilation, often eating disorders, mood disorders. So you get a cluster of symptoms, but I would still, even if it's become quite trendy, I would still not ignore it, because you need to explore, and a therapist will be able to know whether there's distress. And it's very worrying, and it's on the increase. And it's not only with girls, it's also with boys, although we see it a lot with teenage girls.
Yeah. Okay. I've got 1,000 questions, but I'll give Justin a chance now.
I'll just pose one of my 2 questions, and I'd like to cycle back to when the wheel was still round. And I would like to ask you, a lot of teenagers have this low energy. We spoke about the fact that they're tired, and I suppose it's just the sake of the way they are, the way they're tired just because they've got so much growth, so much development, so much weighing on their mind all the time. So I understand the tiredness. What I don't understand is that even though they're so tired, they still continue. A lot of teens often play games right through the night. And there's so many opportunities just to break the cycle and actually recharge and re-energize, but we don't see that in some teens. Why is that?
I think partly teens seek the reward. They value the reward more than the risk. So even though they know logically, if you're going to be online or gaming or whatever till early in the hours of the morning, you're going to be exhausted. But they weigh the benefits of the reward much more than they value then they consider the risk. So they know there's a risk, but for them, the reward is much stronger. And I think that relates back to the fact that the limbic system is much more developed rather than the prefrontal cortex, which would be able to make a more rational, mature decision if it was working properly. So I think that's what it is.
Thank you.
I mean, that's partially what it is. I'm sure there are many other things, but I think that accounts for some of it. Because it's not that they don't know the risks, they just don't care as much about the risk at that moment. They want that reward, and that reward is that dopamine and that thrill of what they're enjoying from their online gaming. And then obviously it gets into a pattern where their body clock they can't go to sleep earlier because they're not used to it. And it becomes a vicious cycle.
How long would it take to break that pattern?
It's hard to say exactly, but it can be broken. But it's very hard because you would need to get buy-in. You know, our teenagers are clever and strategic and manipulative. And I think that I think it's a combination of having a good relationship with them, getting their buy-in, getting them to see. I think the patterns can be broken, but I think it's very difficult. And it really just depends on how at times if you could appeal to the maturity, but it also you have to look at what is the benefit and what is the drive behind what their behavior is, because if you're not understanding what that is, it's going to be very difficult to break it, because you can't physically get a child to fall asleep. You can't, you might take away the devices or switch off the Wi-Fi, but it's, there's a limit to what you can do. But remember, you're still the parent. So there are things that you can do that you feel are important to put boundaries in place. You just have to be aware of what you can do, and then also know that it's not completely up to you.
All right. Thank you, Ruth. I'm going to ask any of the parents now at this point if they've got questions that they would like to ask. Otherwise I'm sure Justin will add in his other couple he had there. So parents, please ask your questions. Ruth is with us for a little longer, and she's got invaluable advice here for us.
Ruth,
Yes.
Would you like to continue for a little bit, and while we give people a chance to pose their questions?
With pleasure. So what I thought about talking a little bit about is how to open the door to discussing the difficulties that your children are having. And ideally, there should be a series of ongoing conversations, like ongoing check-ins that you have with your child, because this can support your child's mental health, not just when there's a problem, but also give you a foundation of being able to talk about these things. Very important, and is making it safe for your child to discuss issues with you. If children anticipate that they're going to be judged, or they're going to be lectured, or they're going to be punished, they're not going to talk about touchy subjects. I had a difficult issue with my teen when she told me that she'll tell me what she gets up to at parties, but if she tells me and is honest, there can't be consequences. So she said to me, you can choose. Either I'll tell you and there can't be consequences, or I won't tell you. And she put me in a very difficult position, because I said, you need to be honest with me, because if I find out I can't trust you, then there'll be things I won't let you do. But it can't be a blanket immunity or indemnity that if you tell me things that you're doing things that are really dangerous, that I can't have a response. So that has been a tricky one to navigate. I'm assuming she's at a party tonight, so I have to be very careful, but I'm assuming that she's still telling us things and we are dealing with things. And the one time she said, you can't be cross with me because at least I was honest. And I said, I'm not cross with you. I'm just so disappointed at your poor judgment. She said, I knew you'd use the disappointed sentence. But so this is hard to navigate. And psychologists and counselors and psychiatrists I've seen with my colleagues, we all struggle with it. But essentially, children need to know that in a crisis, they can turn to you. And you want them, if it's 3 o'clock in the morning and they're in trouble, you want them to be able to phone you because they know you'll help. That you don't want them to fear you, so you don't want them not to turn to you because they're scared they'll get into trouble. Again, it doesn't mean that anything goes, but it's about making sure that they know that ultimately you'll be there for them, even if you don't necessarily approve of everything they do. So making sure that it's as judgment-free as possible will help you know more about what's going on. It's very important to realize, though, that it's not appropriate to know everything because there have to be some boundaries. So it's not appropriate to be your child's best friend, and it's not appropriate for you to tell them everything. And it's not appropriate for them to tell you everything. But in terms of really like sad and deep and worrying feelings and thoughts, that they need to be able to tell you. And if they aren't, it's important that you provide them with the resources to someone they can talk to, whether it's a family member or school. Some people encourage people to speak to a person in the religious community. I am a bit more hesitant because sometimes teens need to say something that might not be received in the most tolerant way. And so I would always say, stick to mental health professionals until you know what's going on, because you don't want your teen to feel that because they might be different, they're going to be judged. Also, this is important, resolve to listen more than you speak. Often we start talking to our children, but then we land up lecturing them. It's very important that you let them speak. And you don't jump on to say, well, when I was your age, and I know because this happened to me. Also, accept some silence. Your child might not want to speak to you, and it might be hard, and there might be lots of breaks and silences, and you have to be okay to sit with that. And sometimes to say, it sounds like it's hard for you to talk to me now. Can we talk again tomorrow? Also, I think the way that you also bring up things with your children, try not to say it in a critical way. So instead of saying, you know, you've been behaving really strangely, or your behavior is so rude, to talk factually and say, I've noticed that you don't join us for suppers anymore. I've noticed that you are not going out with your friends. So speaking about it factually and talking about your concerns rather than coming across as in a critical way is also very helpful. Also, realizing mental health stigma still exists, unfortunately. So your child might not want to admit and might feel embarrassed, to kind of say that there are issues, even though I think that in a way, sometimes social media can be helpful in this way, because there's so much discussion around teenagers who struggle with eating issues. As long as you have to monitor this as well, because it needs to be people that they're following who have a healthy stance, because you also can get people who then encourage very worrying behavior. So there's good stuff that happens, and then there's difficult stuff. And also try and ask your child to share some of their world with you. Try to find out what games they're playing, what social media they're on, just so that you have a common vocabulary. Also, try not to blame yourself for your child's difficulties. You know, life is hard. We're doing the best we can. And sometimes we're not. We're just doing what we can to survive. And just realize that it's very important that not to criticize yourself and blame yourself. Things are hard, and it doesn't help if you start saying, oh, it's my fault, it's my fault. Rather look at what you can do. So I think it's also just proactively like promoting mental health. It's not just responding to problems, but also putting things in that make healthy habits in the family, family time together, make things fun, and just encourage. like we're talking about risk taking, encourage risks such as trying out for the school play, or asking someone on a date, even if it sounds difficult, or, you know, running 5Ks park run if you don't run. Doesn't have to be the life-threatening risks. You know, give opportunities for safer, healthier risks. Yeah. So have any other questions come up, or everyone's...
Does anyone have a question? Do you want to type a question in the chat if you too oh, wait, there's a whole load in the chat.
Oh,
Let
me go to the chat.
Does playing video games affect the reward and failure responses in the brains of teenagers in more extremes for kids of neurodiversity? I think we've answered that a little bit.
No, I think it does. Let me just go to, where is it? Does playing video games affect the reward and failure responses in the brains of teenagers? I think for kids of neurodiversity, you know, it's obviously hard to generalize because neurodiverse kids are diverse. So there's not one kind of, you know, all kids are different, even when they share certain difficulties. But definitely, I think that you do see a lot of kids with neurodiverse kids being drawn. I think it also gives them a safe way away from other people. So, you know, they can feel quite safe in terms of mastering something, and it also, you know, giving them kind of, they don't have the pressure of dealing with real life interactions. So I think they can be more susceptible.
Okay. There's the next one down is going back to creating connections and hearing the child. How do we create meaningful connections, and how do we demonstrate that we do hear our teenagers?
I think it's about spending time doing things that are not just school related, doing things that are fun. Obviously, if you can start it earlier, it's better, but you're now dealing with teenagers. But it's also not seeing yourself only as the person who says, do this, do that, but seeing yourself as a person who's also interested in learning about this interesting new person, and also forgiving yourself when you react, you know, in ways that I sometimes find myself shouting at my 13-year-olds who can just be so impossible and so irrational and everything I've spoken about. And then he said to me recently, for a psychologist, your responses are very, what did he say? For a psychologist, your responses are not what I would have expected. So he was right. I was responding, and then luckily my daughter, who has more connections to her prefrontal cortex because she's older, said, yeah, because she was responding like a mom, not like a therapist. And that is true. So just forgive yourself. I was responding like a very frustrated mother with a really impossible, irrational 13-year-old who was acting like he was 3. But then I calmed down, and so realize that we do what we do. We can't be perfect. It's very hard to be a good enough parent to to other kids, but to be a good enough parent to kids who are difficult and kids who have these who are adolescents or neurodiverse is very hard. So I think it's about making sure that you do things and you create connections, and you're not only the person who's criticizing, but that you also just show interest in who your teenager's becoming and what they're interested in. So I think that's really important. And also just knowing that you don't have to be perfect. And also bear in mind, and I say this, and I say this to myself now, the children that you knew, even though some of them might have been difficult, before they became even more difficult as teenagers, will come back to you in a recognizable format. You just need to be patient.
It just takes a couple of years.
You see glimpses every now and again, and you just grab those experiences and hold on to them.
Okay. Please explain the different types of therapy and how to know which type of psychologist, psychiatrist to choose for a teen with anxiety.
So for me, the different types of therapy is not as important as the right therapist. So there's CBT, which deals with symptoms. For some kids who are very concrete, they might want to, go to something like that. But I think finding a therapist who your child feels comfortable with and who you like is most important. I think sometimes when we say choosing a psychiatrist, it sounds like we've got so much choice. At the moment, there's so few South African psychiatrists who deal with teenagers that it's probably about who you get an appointment with. But essentially, your child needs to feel that the person that they're dealing with, that they feel comfortable with them. And it might take a while because your child might not feel comfortable with anybody. But if your child finds it intolerable, there's a problem. I think it's the personality of the therapist more than the therapy. And the various, I think a good therapist can reach a child with most kinds of therapies, but it's about competence and experience, but it's also just about connection. So, yeah.
All right. Then we've got, is there any difference between brain development of girls and boys? Because girls are more difficult than boys.
Well, I don't know, in some ways, girls can be more difficult. In some ways, boys can be more difficult. There are differences because of the hormones. I mean, that's a whole other thing. And I think that they're probably the medical people or psychiatrists can address this more. But I do think that there are differences in terms of their heightened need for maybe social acceptance, the heightened focus on appearance. But, things are changing so much that boys who don't feel socially acceptable and boys who feel that they don't fit into what you're supposed to look like also struggle. But I think that the differences, they are probably in terms of hormonal issues that make the difference in terms of how difficult girls are, how difficult boys are. I think that I don't know if girls are more difficult, but I mean that is that parent's experience. And I think in certain ways they can be, but in other ways, sometimes girls, you're able to, I mean, it's just such a generalization, but girls tend to be able to speak more openly. Teenage boys tend to not feel comfortable speaking, so they close up. So sometimes it's easier to engage with girls. But yeah, I mean, I think it's just so complicated, and I think there are differences.
There's definitely, teenagers are definitely complicated. And
so
yes, but between hormones, neurodiversities, teenage behaviors, everything becomes quite complicated. And, on the other side of having been through teenagers, my children are in their 20s. So they do, in actual fact, my twins are in their 30s now. That's a bit ridiculous. It's difficult to admit to that one. but eventually they do mature. And eventually you should get that child back that you understand. And being a parent is an incredibly valuable and worthwhile journey, but it is exhausting at times.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I know that as a parent, I often realized that I was messing up. And then I actually resolved at the end of it to do the best I could do today in today's circumstances. And if I messed up today, to try and do better tomorrow.
Yeah, and I think another thing in terms of connecting with children is sense of humor. Laugh with your child, find things that you both find funny, and joke and laugh, because that is so connecting. And then if you can actually find that you're laughing at each other, not in a horrible way, but laughing at how ridiculous you both can be in moments of irrationality, that can be very bonding. So being forgiving of each other and just laughing together.
No, absolutely. And keeping the communication channels open.
Always. Yeah.
Any more questions from anyone? Any parting words, Ruth?
I would just say it's not only a time of vulnerability, it's also a time of great growth and creativity. And so it can be very exciting, even though it can be daunting. So I think that we mustn't get stuck into how terribly frightening this is, but also that it's an adventure. But if you're unsure, ask for help and get support. I think like support groups and like talks and speaking to other parents can be so important, so you don't feel alone.
Okay. And also to everyone out there, remember, we have plenty of support available at school. And if we're not the right fit for this kind of support you need, we will try our very best to point you in the right direction. And if we're not sure of the direction, we will try and find out by using the resources at our disposal. So, anything else from anyone? Okay, then I'm going to say thank you so much, Ruth. I think that this has been a fabulous conversation and talk, and I really appreciate you spending this time with us, and I'm sure that everyone else that was listening gained some valuable insight. And
thank you for the time, for everyone who did come and listen. I hope you found it valuable. Thank you, and just have a wonderful holiday. I hope you guys get breaks and try have some fun with your teens.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ruth.
Okay,
thank you, everyone. Sure. Night.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Well,